All right. Good morning. Good afternoon. Professor Barry here. Yeah, we are moving into another area of stratification. Last week, we explored social stratification, looking at class inequality, income inequality. As I mentioned before, these topics are broad and deep. If you're continue on your education, taking classes in sociology or other areas that specialize in addressing inequality, take whole courses in each of these different areas and multiple courses. So we're just kind of touching surface, kind of getting some general frameworks and ideas. It's kind of the point, the overall goal and perspective. This week we're moving into race and class stratification, or race stratification, race and ethnicity. We'll talk about both of those. And with that, let's kind of get started. A lot of ground to cover. So let's get moving. Yeah, I think, try to make a connection between the past and the present, I think is always useful. I was never a huge student of history until the further I got into sociology. And then I think it probably happens with a lot of people, the more and more just lived experience, start to understand and appreciate the influence of history on the present and making that connection between the past and the present. I think to understand today, you got to go back to the past, to understand what's going on today, or put it in perspective at least. So one thing to kind of consider here is that we're going to sort of provide the perspective or demonstrate sort of the invention of race as a biological entity. So this is like a historical perspective to understand how we understand and see race today. Race has no biological basis. There is no race gene. There is no biological determinant of race. Race is a human social construction. It's a human project. And we'll kind of lay out the foundations in a little bit about sort of the biological, this idea that race is biology or determined by biology, takes place at a specific moment in time or time period in American and Western European history. Biological ideas, of race are human inventions in the 17 and 1800s. All the way through in the 1900s, biologists and others were advancing the idea that race is biology. So it was a project engaged by scientists, but then also transformed into different areas of society, well beyond science. So that's a whole nother area to kind of get into, is like it started this project in biology, but then kind of diffused throughout culture and became an accepted way of thinking for a long period of time, that there are biological aspects of race. We recognize that now that race, this idea that race is biology, it's biased, it's inadequate, it's reflective of racism at a particular moment in time. It's a reflection of white supremacy. Like biological ideas of race became justifications for racial inequality. There's a view today, like biological ideas of race were pseudoscience or scientific racism. Ideas of race determined by biology, they acted as an ideology. To go back to last week, the principles of stratification, one of them, that stratification requires the support of an ideology. And this idea that race is determined by biology is an ideology, so that certain groups are more intellectually inferior or superior. Certain races see this idea biologically, certain races are a certain way, provides an explanation or an ideology to justify stratification. It could explain, when these biological notions of race were around, tying into explaining why certain groups are more likely to engage in crime versus others, or IQ level, or sexual behavior, or general temperament. So a lot of different things that were going on to trying to explain why it is that there were inequalities in society, and that this biological explanation was a really powerful one. And then eventually transition away from that belief in race as biology to race as a social construct, probably 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, starting to make this transition to recognizing race as a social construct. And I think we're still in that process. I don't think the biological ideas of race have fully disappeared from American culture. You definitely find it on the fringes of the alt-right, white nationalist groups. still sort of advocating, seeing that race is biology. But for the science circles, it's been it's been largely removed or largely no longer accepted, this idea that race is biology. There may be a fringe few people, but it's by and large no longer accepted, viewed as a valid explanation within the sciences. So the question to ask today is like, what is the ideology that exists today? If we don't have the ideology of biology to explain racial inequalities, what is the ideology that we have today? And one of the ideologies is colorblind racism, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on. So here's an image of biological construction of race during a time period when this invention of biological ideas about race. And you can kind of see, we can look at it right now, and probably most of us see, a lot of racism built into this depiction, this idea of biological race. There's a hierarchy going on here, a very Darwinian evolutionary perspective, a hierarchy of the Aryan race, the white race, of Caucasians being the top of the hierarchy. This fascination of measurement of the human skull, this connection between the primate and evolution outside of the primate to this sort of enlightened species. And just that depiction, that representation takes us to a place of recognizing or seeing that racism is pretty blatant. But at that time period when these things were being created, that was the accepted view of that particular moment in time. Okay, so biological ideas about race did not exist prior to the Enlightenment, prior to the birth of science as we know it. So 1700s, biological ideas of race did not exist. Go down to another bullet point in ancient Egypt, ancient Rome, ancient Greece, different communities and societies. There is no biological race. These different communities identified difference, but there had been more along the lines of what we identify as ethnic group differences. Language, where people were from, customs, traditions. There were being groups marked difference between insider and outsider, but it wasn't this idea of a biological race. Like that's very much a science project invention. The Races of Man, a book, Civic Biology by George William Hunter in 1914. So if you're familiar with the Scopes monkey trial, sort of a trial addressing whether or not teaching evolution in schools in 1925, the Scopes monkey trial, this is an excerpt from a book talking about civic biology. And the reason I sort of brought this one in is to demonstrate that like these ideas of biological ideas of race got really entrenched into ways of thinking, education. This was the way in which ideas were being promoted. And what the Scopes monkey trial was about teaching about evolution and whether or not that should be taught in schools. And no one's questioning the validity of these ideas about race. And you can kind of read through on your own, just sort of like, just sort of read about this idea of the races of man. There's 5 races on Earth, each of the different customs, structure, nature. It's like this idea that there's these distinct racial groups that are rooted in biology and that they have different characteristics, not only physical, but temperament, personality, and things like that. Biological ideas of race emerged during a time period of colonization, exploration, and the development of science. In a lot of ways, biological ideas of race become that justification for colonizing different groups, peoples, cultural genocide, domination of another group, another society. So here we go back to like the early foundation of biological ideas about race. Linnaeus was one of the first, often the first, identified as the first to lay out the foundation of biological ideas about race. And it was like he had a lot of different editions of Systema Naturae, and in the 9th, 10th edition, or the transition between the 9th and the 10th, is when he sort of made this sort of leap from these, where he identified before 4 races. They're kind of like more like geographic regions. And by the time he got to the 10th edition, now he's inserting more and more things about temperament, attributes, dispositions, things like that. And it's at that point in time that there's this recognition that it's transitioned to scientific racism, that it's a different, that these ideas about race is and connecting races with temperament, behavior, uh, intelligence, other things like that. We're getting further and further into scientific racism. Now there's a hierarchy with the Europeanists at the top and Africanus at the bottom. So there's a hierarchy that Linnaeus gets into. Blumenbach, 1776, he identified 5 racial categories. Like now we start to get kind of questioned a little bit, like, okay, well, how many racial categories and biological races are there? This is why it's kind of faulty. And other reasons why it's faulty is like there's no way to mark. These are humans that are creating these kind of categories themselves. But these ideas of biological race became taken for granted. If I use the idea of hegemony, domination by consent, this became the dominant way of thinking in culture, and it became very hegemonic. People weren't questioning this idea by biological race. It could be used as a way of reinforcing inequality, justifying inequality, explaining away inequality, and it wasn't questioned for a long period of time. If you're interested in kind of exploring this, idea or kind of diving further into it, it's a great book, Stephen Jay Gould, an anthropologist, The Mismeasure of Man. It's about 40 some years old. It's a great book, though, kind of like how scientists were measuring gender, race, and class, and the faults in sort of their measurement and how they went about that process. More contemporary Neil Irvin Painter, historian, African-American historian, History of White People. It's a fascinating book just about her examination of the development of ideas about race. And if you're interested in that topic, that's a great resource. So the consequences of biological ideas about race, justified slavery, justified indentured servitude, justified in the United States, the movement west, the genocide, extermination, the domination of Native peoples in the United States. It justified the treatment of a lot of racial others. The first law, or the first federal law excluding a particular racial group in terms of immigration, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. That was part built upon biological ideas about race. National Origins Act, the Immigration Act of 1924, was an act restricting immigration from certain countries, Eastern European, Southern European countries. There's a lot of racism sort of built in that sort of idea as well. Biological ideas justified separate but equal Jim Crow laws in the United States that were started in 1896 all the way until 1954 and beyond. And it kind of extended into not only, outside of race, but also into class, sexual identity. This sort of biological notions could be used in a way as an ideology to justify inequality. And then you get into like social Darwinism and eugenics. Social Darwinism, survival of the fittest. Darwin didn't actually come up with that idea. It was like a cousin of his that came up with this idea of social Darwinism, that there was this sort of like the struggle for survival, and those who struggle the best would survive the best, that we need to promote the strong genes, the eugenics, you meaning good genes, eugenics to promote good genes in a country to develop a more solid, stable community society that's less prone to crime and poverty and other vices and things like that. And that idea still continues on today. There was a very controversial book in 1994, The Bell Curve, where the authors were arguing that the reason for African Americans to be more likely to be in prison, to be incarcerated, and to unemployment, different factors, was related to biological ideas about race. And it's this argument that we still haven't fully moved away from. It's still part of culture, part of society. If you're interested in exploring eugenics, this book, War Against the Weak, is a really fascinating read. Think about eugenics, this idea of controlling the genes of a population. Think about oftentimes Nazism and Hitler. The ideas of eugenics are coming right out of the United States, Cold Spring Harbor, New Jersey, scientists in the United States working with scientists in Western European countries. Like, these ideas of eugenics are deep and profound in society. And if you're quick video, here, sort of, you can type that in. I just put this here. I can't click on it as mentioned before, but there's the information for it. Gives you sort of an overview of social Darwinism you might find helpful. Well, why did it become, the dominant view for a long period of time? I think, one, these ideas of biological ideas about race help to justify exploitation. I think that's linked to capitalism itself. I mean, the production of cotton and tobacco and development of a slave system in the United States, this form of capitalism in the United States that's developing, biological ideas of race, allowed for this sort of a labor force. And this became a way to justify that kind of exploitation. It also became a cultural way of knowing, like hegemony became part of like the cultural way of thinking and knowing. If I go back to beginner's mind, this is the water that people were swimming in at that particular moment in time. People were explaining, this is the dominant way of explaining things, and the majority of people weren't questioning this kind of an explanation. There was also a belief in the promise of modernity, of science, so that these scientists were creating, like, think go back to the Enlightenment, the birth of science. There was a lot of trust, belief, and faith in science. And scientists were, they were reflecting the ideas of the time too. So scientists like, with Linnaeus, is the further he got into his work, or Blumenbach, they're reflecting the racial biases or the racial notions of that particular moment in time. Part of it is that, fears that are going on too. We're talking about urbanization, industrialization during the 1700s and 1800s. A lot of major transformation for Durkheim, anomie, normlessness, a lot of sudden change. And biological ideas of notions of class and race became a way to explain why we have poverty and crime and things like that. It's like the belief that that's due to biological determinants became a enticing explanation, although faulty one for sure. So now we can kind of move into thinking about race as not biology, but race as a social construct. And we've talked about this before, that constructs are human, humans create meaning. Constructs are one way of doing it. Language, systems of language are ways of constructing reality. We view the world through the lens of constructs, through the lens of language. This kind of sounds like a little bit of more Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, although it's much broader than that. So for Berger and Luckman, the authors of this book, The Social Construction of Reality, it's about how a way of thinking, not just like for Sapir-Whorf language, but a way of thinking in society gets developed, reinforced, supported, sometimes challenged, sometimes it's movable. But this idea that we develop ways of thinking within a culture and society, we view the world through that language or through that way of thinking. And it can become very stable, very agreed upon within a culture and society, kind of that water that we swim in, that it's so normalized and taken for granted that people may not question it. They think it's right or correct, or it's invisible, not even recognizing that way of thinking. So it can get institutionalized, be viewed as reality, viewed as truth, even though it's not. And ultimately, these meanings are arbitrary, but they're also very real, because if people define it that way, then it's real. So the Thomas theorem is that idea. If people define it as real, it's real in its consequences. So if it doesn't matter what the reality is, it's how people define it. So biological ideas of race weren't true, they weren't accurate, it wasn't valid. But yet, if people defined it that way, they explained it that way, they see it that way, it becomes real, because then people respond to the world based on the meanings that they've given to things. So there's a lot in that social construction of reality. This is a great short video. Just type that into a search engine, take you to the sort of video of why biological ideas of race are a myth. It gives you also an understanding of the social construction of race along with that. This one here, I think, is a great video to get at, looking at the US Census. This is like a really great way to demonstrate the social construction of race. If you look at the US Census Bureau, you can type into search engine US Census Bureau, racial classifications, historical, something like that. And there's all these kind of like, I know there's different charts you can look at, like over time, when new racial categories got brought into the US Census, or categories were removed, or the language of categories changed. The language of from, within the white community or the Black community, like what are the words and what's the language being used? Who is Asian American? What are the different categories of Asian American? Like, these are all, like, you can kind of get into, like, these are constructs. These are the US Census as an institution is reinforcing particular ideas about race. Now, the US Census today, there's an importance of gathering demographics on racial demographics to see like what's going on in the world around us. So if we didn't collect data around race, then we wouldn't be able to identify things like, well, how many people of different races are, or what is the racial composition of people who work in different industries or who are in college, or healthcare impacts. So it's important to collect data around race, but also important to remember that race is not a biological thing. So the US Census, this is a description of the US Census today, that categories reflect a social definition recognized within the United States or in a country, not an attempt to identify race biologically, anthropologically, or genetically. So the US Census is very, recognizes the importance of gathering data around the ideas about race, but also is making this clear, explicit statement that these categories that are being stated are not reflections of biological, anthropological, genetic ideas about race. And that's a relatively new thing that the US Census put out there. So this is a response to the recognition that race is a social construct. The census changing, making sure, putting language out there to communicate, recognize that the classifications they're using are not trying to reinforce this idea that race is biology. So this is a great short little video. If you're interested, give you a little bit more perspective, a little bit more information in that space. So I can kind of illustrate the ideas of social construction of race. You could do it in a lot of different ways, but here's just a few different examples. There's a book I mentioned last week on caste, and what Isabel Wilkerson arguing or providing perspective that the U.S. is a caste system. It's been that way. Historically, it's been a caste system, and there's a lot of structured inequalities that are built in American culture and society. So she was talking about this book in an audience one time. The book was released in 2020, and then a Nigerian playwright came up to her after the talk and said, there are no Black people in Africa. And when Wilkerson heard that, she was like, well, that was a really profound way to get at this idea about the arbitrary nature of ideas about race, that in Africa, the language of using Black is not something that would be used, that an individual who immigrated to the United States or maybe to, Western European countries somewhere, they become Black when they move, like the language of that particular country that they're immigrating to becomes the language. So you could look at in Brazil, there's a very fluid system of recognizing race, where there's what's called the color gradient, where over 130 racial categories are recognized in Brazil. Race and class interact more dynamically in Brazil than in the United States. More allowance for within a particular family, same biological parents, to have kids, offspring that are of different races. And that would be confused from an American viewpoint, confuse us, like how that could even be possible that someone of a same biological parents could have kids from that are different races. Like it's just confusing, but not confusing from Brazil's perspective, because there's other factors, other ways of distinguishing between different races. In the United States, we have what's called historically the one drop rule. This gets us, biological ideas of race were built upon this idea. Eugenics built upon this particular idea. This hierarchy is within that. The one drop rule, that if you're of one drop of African descent, then you were African American, you were Black, you were Negro, the language of the time. So the one drop rule. So if we go back to like separate but equal, this idea of Jim Crow South that started in 1896, a case of Plessy versus Ferguson. This is like the Rosa Parks story of the day, where it's the person, Plessy was 1/8 of African descent, and was riding a railroad car, wasn't allowed to ride a railroad car that was in a white, it wasn't, that was in the white section of the railroad car, and filed an injunction or became part of the court case, went all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court came back and said separate but equal is legal. So it established that idea, separate but equal. But paying attention here that it's 1/8, and it's like this is arbitrary. This is sort of that one drop. Like it doesn't like how do you justify that? How do you explain that? And the laws in the United States that were miscegenation, the mixing of races, like a Racial Integrity Act of 1924, prohibiting the marrying of people from different races, that there were laws put into place all the way until 1967 in the case of Loving versus Virginia, where it was established that the federal government, state governments can no longer ban individuals of different races from marrying. Since 1967. So the idea of the one-drop rule is really a powerful force in American culture for a long time. There's like these weird things like and powerful things like the association of jazz and rock and roll with race and criminality, and this idea that jazz and rock and roll were promoting the mixing of races, and there was like this fear and alarm and reaction from predominantly the white community and the middle class white community about the evils or the moral improprieties of these particular forms of music. Another example, the one drop rule, is Susie Gilroy Phipps. She thought she was identified as white. It's how she recognized herself. She went to apply for a visa or a passport. I can't remember which one it was. She got her birth certificate, never saw it before. And on her birth certificate, it said, in terms of her racial designation, at a race at birth, said colored. And she went to the court, said, I want to have that changed to white because this is how I see myself. And the court came back in 1983 and said, basically denied her appeal. The court recognized the arbitrary nature of racial designations, but said that's the way it was recorded. That's the way it needs to be kept. She was 1/32 of African descent. I mean, it's like that gives you that sort of idea, the one drop rule of how powerful that was. Another idea of the social construction of race is in American culture, this idea of Asians as the model minority. Asian Americans as an overall collective tend to have higher levels of education than of any racial group, including whites, wealth, income, education. So viewed as sort of this model minority. Well, there's a myth to this idea. It's constructing this idea that Asian Americans are this model minority, but it's not. It's minimizing or removing from our view the complexity of all the ethnic groups that are within that category of Asian American. There's 28. There's probably, depends on who's counting, but 28 different racial ethnic groups underneath that umbrella of Asian American. And there's a lot of variability in terms of income, wealth, educational level. Somebody who came to the United States as a refugee or as an immigrant, somebody came depending on their class position when they came. Did they come from a country that, did they come from a country that was experiencing a lot of turmoil and war, or did they come from a country that provided a lot of, where a person had a lot of higher education before they came to the United States? So the conditions before a person came and kind of the conditions they came into when they came to the United States can make a big difference. So if you look at Asian Indians, have the highest level of household income, but then if you look at individuals from who immigrated to the United States from or Vietnamese Americans, it's a different story, or Cambodian Americans. So this idea of the model minority becomes a new ideology or becomes a sort of myth. It reinforces the idea that Asian Americans were able to make it. And look, they're incredibly successful in terms of economically. Therefore, if other groups are not making it, the fault is in the group itself. So one of the problems of the model minority idea, I think it becomes a fabricated story that's reinforcing this idea that the Asian Americans have been successful. Therefore, if other groups aren't successful, there's something going on within that culture or that group itself. Okay, so here's another example, one last example of like the social construction of race. And I bring this up here because I think it's just a really fascinating time period and sort of thing to look at and examine, and it kind of, again, illustrates the idea. In the 1940s, 1950s, there was this idea about passing, a concern among individuals and within culture that people of African descent could pass as white. Lena Horne, she was a Hollywood actress. She becomes an example of somebody who could pass as white. If I put that in the historical context around this, 1950s, rise and development of the civil rights movement, 1940s, 1930s, the Great Migration out of the South to the North. Probably go back even a little bit further during, it's the war industries. Blacks are migrating out of the South, moving to the North. More opportunities for blacks and whites to be in the same space and interaction and similar community. So now all of a sudden, like there's a lot of change going on that's happening in culture and society at that time. And there's this idea about passing, that a person who is black could pass as white. There's a film from Elia Kazan called Pinky. This is a depiction of a mother and a daughter. She grows up in the South. She leaves her home in the South, goes to the North. She passes as white. She trains as a nurse. She falls in love with the white guy. At some point in time in the movie, they develop a romantic relationship. They kiss each other. And this film gets banned. It becomes really controversial. The film gets banned from a community in Marshall, Texas, becomes a court case at the state Supreme Court of whether or not that film could be banned from the public. And when Kazan cast the actors for the movie, he intentionally cast two white actors for the movie. And, is the idea, the thought that that this film was promoting interracial relationships. So this idea about passing, it was really powerful, like this fear that took over for some people within the community. And this is a model from Carnegie Institute trying to alleviate people's fears about this idea about passing, like saying that if a white man and a white woman, mulatto would have been a person, the language for somebody who's half white, half black. This like even that we're doing this, it's like so we're constructing these ideas and creating these categories about race. There are categories like octoroon, somebody who's 1/8, and these are inventions and categories, constructions about race. So anyway, like white man, woman, white man, woman, what happens? Like we're saying, okay, half black, well, also half white. Like, why are we even making these designations to begin with? The idea, then you get all these kind of racism that we can kind of see, I think, within this racism as well as classism within this depiction. The idea of like Caucasian beauty and there's this depiction that's going on. This is where Stephen Jay Gould, the Mismeasure of Man, his argument a little bit is that scientists are doing this work. They're not consciously trying to reinforce ideas about racist ideas, but they're doing it because it's part of their way of thinking. And I think this applies here. We don't know the intent behind those who created this diagram, but I think we can sort of argue or provide a perspective that these researchers or whoever created the diagram they're reinforcing a way of thinking that they have, and they're bringing that forward. So they're trying this, Carnegie Institute is trying to alleviate the public's concern, to say, look, what can happen is if you have a person who can pass as white, they marry a white person, they will have a white baby, and I don't know, just like this, I think is this time period in American history and culture of what's going on, why this idea of passing was prevalent, and how we think it, traces us back into this idea of biological ideas of race. Okay, so while ideas of race created by humans, arbitrary, flexible, doesn't mean they don't exist in our imagination, our perceptions. So they're constructs, but yet they're real because we view the world through that particular lens. Okay, so now it's going to move into structural inequality, and we're going to move away from just the individual and away from just the group and get into institutions and structures themselves. So I'm going to define a couple terms. Prejudice is attitude, and discrimination is behavior. And there's different combinations of those. It's possible to be prejudiced, of course, and to be discriminatory. It's also possible to be prejudiced, but to not discriminate, maybe because working within an institution and realizing the consequences for that, for discriminating. So a person may still hold on to prejudices, but they may not discriminate. Anyway, the importance of making that distinction is to realize there are different things. Like it's possible that discrimination is going on without prejudice actually happening. And that's going to be more true probably at the institutional level. So we're going to move away from just like looking at individual attitudes, individual just behavior, and move into institutions. That institutions can be discriminatory in terms of policies and practices. And then we have to move away from thinking about intent and think about like things that are happening within institutions that are reinforcing inequalities. Racism, I think, is an important part of discussing like thinking about discrimination and thinking about the institutional level. If you look at a dictionary definition, a belief that race accounts for differences in character or ability, and that one race is superior than others. Sociology is going to make it more dynamic, add more to that definition of racism. And I think that the dictionary definition is too limited, and it doesn't really address fully ideas about racism. Racism is an ideology, so it's an explanation for justifying inequality. So racism is an ideology, or racism ideas that are supporting racism. It's their ideologies that support racism. Maybe that's a better way of saying that. Maybe I should restate that ideas that we have within culture and society that are reinforcing racial inequalities, this is racism. So that it gets us into the beliefs and the ideas within society itself. Things that are racism justifies different statuses for different individuals, different treatment of different individuals. Racism just provides that justification. There's a recognition with racism that a sociological definition, recognizing that races are not biological and neither are races inherently unequal. It's structure, institution, other things that are going on that are shaping the experiences of different racial groups in society. Racial inequalities are structured in society. It's not just the result of individuals, it's structured in society itself, and racism justifies those inequalities. Racism is also linked to not only groups that are experiencing disadvantage, but also groups who are experiencing advantage, so privilege. And we kind of think about anti-racism. So there's racism, where we get this ideology that's reinforcing racial inequalities. And then anti-racism, is talking about to be neutral and to say, well, I'm not causing any harm. And to be neutral is actually supporting a system of racism itself. That anti-racism is working to dismantle racism. And there's kind of a viewpoint or perspective that unless an individual is working to dismantle it, they're actually contributing to. So being neutral, for example, is not working to address the inequalities that are in society. A powerful book to kind of get at like institutional levels of discrimination or institutional racism, white supremacy, The Color of Law, historical practice of redlining, the ways in which suburbia was created or different cities and different suburban environments based on housing, zoning laws, rules, regulations. The development of suburbs was a white exclusive communities. I mean, these are where African Americans were not allowed to buy homes in a lot of suburban communities. They were restricted. People who bought a home and tried to sell it as a white person could not sell it to a person of color. Like there are these covenants and things going on. And so it's the mortgage industry, so it's an institution, it's different things that are reinforcing that. This is a really powerful video, I think, too, of trying to understand the urban landscape, understand a lot of different communities, the development of suburbia, also meant building superhighways that oftentimes cut through city centers and had a really powerful impact on a lot of communities of color, a lot of white communities or poor white communities, working class communities, when these highways were built in the 1950s, 1960s. The birth of hip hop, I think you go back to the building of these highways and the economic impact of these highways and impact on communities gave rise to a lot of inequities that happen. Think about institutional racism and think about the ways in which power or privilege and domination are connected. Affirmative action of trying to address racial inequalities. Affirmative action got started in 1965, prohibiting discrimination based on race, color, religion, national origin. There was a backlash to affirmative action. So we have this act was trying to address institutional racism, institutional discrimination. Colleges have been working with how to to what degree or how to incorporate the racial background of applicants for college admissions. Race is a consideration. Race is not a determining factor. There's been a long history of race and college admission. 1983, I think, was the first court case that I'm aware of. University of California, Berkeley, or maybe it's Davis, versus Bakke, a white student. Bakke applied for medical school, denied medical school admission to medical school, and he filed a court case or for an injunction, said, "Hey, I was um, uh, unfair treatment, that other people were given more advantage than me based on race, and that this is discriminatory." Well, I don't want to go through all that history, but recently, in 2023, Students for Fair Admissions Incorporated versus Presidents and Fellows Harvard College took kind of more away from colleges and universities to bring race into the discussion, more centrally into thinking about college admissions. Again, not race as a determining factor, but race as being a factor to consider. And this is, to me, like an example of institutional racism, like supporting that particular court case, is that there's a lot of focus on race and how to consider race, and taking more and more opportunities of institutions to consider race. But yet things like legacy status, if you had a family member who went to that university, which would be predominantly for these elite institutions, be predominantly white, then you get an advantage. People aren't questioning that particular component. So there's an inequity going on here between those two different things. And there's privileges being protected and race is being under scrutiny, or race in terms of examining college admissions. And it's a way of thinking about the way racism operates. We can provide this justification, like a large ideological kind of thing that's justifying why race should not be considered for college admissions, but yet we're not having a discussion about legacy admissions. There's an inconsistency between the two, and how do we think about that? We have to go to, I think, our more macro level way of thinking about it. This is a great overview of affirmative action. I encourage you to watch it. Provides a perspective of the value, the importance of affirmative action. Women have actually probably been the number one beneficiaries of affirmative action. And sometimes we don't think about that affirmative action. It applies to more than race. Institutional discrimination. So I'm going to use this example to get at this institutional discrimination. Voting rules, regulations, long history. After the Civil War, Reconstruction, Blacks getting the right to vote. Then there became all these things that followed afterwards to restrict the vote of the Black vote. You get literacy tests. There's the word, if you heard the word grandfathered, somebody gets grandfathered in, and into like a policy, a new law gets created or a new policy gets created, and then some people like get grandfathered in where they get to comply with the pre-existing rules and regulations, and they get grandfathered in is the language. Well, that language comes from that these things like the literacy test, that whites were being impacted by that. And so states, cities started to put forward grandfather clauses that if you were a person whose grandfather was able to vote, you didn't have to be subjected to things like literacy tests. And these are like institutional discrimination, institutional racism that's going on. A lot of discussions today about is there like voter ID laws. It's like this is colorblind racism today. I think there's a good argument for that. I think you can definitely want to have fair elections and make sure people have who are voting are should be voting. But there's a lot of stuff. There's a lot of history about racism and voting, and racial inequalities in terms of voting. And I think there's a good case to be made. A lot of stuff that's going on today. There's a lot of racism that's built upon that, of restricting the rights of certain groups of people. Okay, let's kind of move into whiteness. I think it's interesting to think about in a Pew Research study that in 2019, % of groups who believe that race is an important part of who they are. And I see that for whites, not really recognizing that race is an important part of their identity. And the reason I bring this data up is to encourage a way of thinking that members of the dominant group are going to probably not think about themselves in terms of a racial identity as much as in other individuals, because they've experienced a lot of privilege throughout their lives, racial privilege. It's been largely invisible and harder to see. And people who have a different experience in terms of discrimination are more likely to recognize how race does operate. So getting into whiteness, I think we have to get into sort of like this understanding that we all have racial identities, but members of the dominant group may form a different racial identity in a different way than individuals of a group that's in a more subordinate position in society. White privilege, so is an important topic to talk about. White privilege advantage, it's unearned, often invisible to individuals. People have to be made more conscious and aware of the way privilege operates. Since it's invisible, it's just harder to recognize. I think there's greater recognition today of white privilege than it was 15, 20 years ago, but I think there's a lot of variability in terms of degrees to which people recognize white privilege. This one study to kind of to demonstrate white privilege is a study done in Australia, having a white person and a person of color get on a bus, but when they got on the bus, they told the bus driver they didn't have a fare, like, oh, I don't have the money for the fare. And more statistically significantly, more often than not, the bus driver would allow the white person to enter the bus and to ride without providing a fare. For a person of color, not allowed to do that. So for you kind of get at, like, this is why it's invisible for that white person who got on the bus. It's like, oh, it's a great thing, the bus driver let me on the bus, but not realizing other people may not have the same experience. And it's that idea that I think that makes it invisible. I think, what's important to recognize too, historically, there's been a lot of focus on how are groups disadvantaged, not how are groups advantaged. And that's going to be a different discussion about how does privilege operate. I go back to like legacy status. There's more criticism of legacy status at universities today. More universities are moving away from legacy status recognition. So Johns Hopkins University, other universities are not recognizing or providing kind of points for admissions if you have a family member who went to that university. And to address inequality, you have to address both privilege as well as domination. And it's also important to recognize intersectionality. Race, class, and gender intersect. Not every white person has the same privilege. Privilege depends also on class. And I think if we don't recognize that, I think it's going to be likely you're going to get a lot of backlash among people who maybe experience a lot of economic hardships. Whites who experience economic hardship may not be able to recognize the way that white privilege operates because, like they don't see it. They've seen the economic impact in terms of class and may not be able to see and recognize the white privilege. So I think intersectionality is important to kind of go after. Racial identity formation, different for majority groups, minority groups, distinct identities depending on our race or within the hierarchy or stratification. All members, everybody has a racial identity. It's different for if you're a member of dominant group or versus non-dominant group. Fascinating book called White Fragility. Why it's hard for white people to talk about racism. This has actually been a banned book in Florida as kind of a response to, I don't know, like the state in Florida responding to a lot more conversations going on about race, historical perspectives on race, critical race theory, whatever it may be. But I think D'Angelo has a lot to offer in terms of thinking about this idea about why is it some people have a hard time talking about racial inequality. And I find it just really ironic that we're talking about racial inequality and the response becomes back for some about like concern about critical race theory in school. That's part of white fragility, that kind of response. I think it's good to have debate and critique, but I think there's also to recognize that some of these responses that are coming, like what is that kind of about? For the dominant group, it may not be visible. Maybe unconscious or degrees of consciousness, which people are operating. So anyway, just a difference going on there. So more contemporary form of racism is colorblind racism. Eduardo Bonilla Silva, racism without racist. He talks about racism light, racism with a smile. That post 1950s, 1960s, that racism kind of goes underground a little bit. People are not wearing the dominant group, or people are not wearing their ideas about race on their sleeve anymore. They're very more guarded about making a comment that may be racist, or may appear racist, or may be subjected to a critique of racism. That individuals are using color-coded language. How do whites explain the contradiction between colorblind and color-coded inequality? So Bonilla Silva, like, how do people explain it? And he explains that people explain today in modern day society, this is modern day society, they explain it that through colorblindness. A new explanation that he calls colorblind racism, that the world, and I'll kind of explain this idea of colorblindness. Colorblindness is the idea that that race, people say, well, let me just go to the next slide and kind of go there. I already mentioned before that racism before, pre and post civil rights movement. So racism before the civil rights movement, people wearing on their sleeves afterwards, especially like 80s, 90s and on, more people are more guarded about making statements that may appear racist. Things like all lives matter, like a response to Black Lives Matter, that's colorblind racism. It's like for Black Lives Matter, the reason, addressing Black Lives Matter is the historical subjugation and mistreatment and inequities that are going on in terms of a particular community. To go to like all lives matter, I mean, I can understand why for some people they want to go to that space and say, well, it's all lives matter. It's like, okay, by doing that, it's removing the examination and understanding of a particular group of people who are experiencing historical inequities in society. I think this statement, a T-shirt, I think is a really powerful one. It gets a colorblind racism. I don't see color, but people tell me I'm white. It's like a person's pretending to be colorblind or adhering to the ideas of being colorblind, but we can't be colorblind. The world doesn't operate that way. By promoting this idea about being colorblind, it minimizes, distorts, removes from our examination the way that race actually operates. So it's the new ideology. It's a way of protecting from discussion or examination of racial inequalities. There was an act called the Racial Privacy Act, the Colorblind Act in 2003 in California. It was rejected by voters. This act was trying to establish that federal government, state government, or the state governments would no longer be required to collect data on race for people who are applying for jobs, employment, education, whatever it may be, that it should be colorblind. There shouldn't be any indication of the racial background of the applicant. Well, the problem with that is that institutions, if there's discrimination going on and we're not collecting the data, we're never going to be able to see if the discrimination is going on, right? And so there's a political engine behind this particular act. There was a lot of stuff going on that's kind of shaping and influencing that. There was an interesting study, I think, to get at this, like that interesting study that people who are born blind actually learn to see race. So a famous performer, for example, Ray Charles, he saw race. He saw race because through interactions with people that he's picked up on throughout his life, the ways in which people were talking about race, that even though he couldn't visually see race, he actually came to recognize that there are racial distinctions, there are racial groups, they're all, he's understanding race, even though visually not being able to see race. So it's impossible to be colorblind, but it becomes a new ideology. If you're interested in stuff about whiteness, this book, Good White People, Shannon Sullivan, I think is really a powerful one. She talks about this idea of good white people, this idea that the middle class, white middle class, tries to be like virtuous, that they are the good white people, the bad white people are the lower class white people who are more likely to be racist. But her perspective she's offering is that sometimes there's a lot of virtue signaling among the white middle class, that they're claiming to be the good white people, but yet they're engaged in a lot of colorblind racism. They don't see the ways in which they're minimizing the way that race operates. They're not recognizing it. They see themselves as good white people. But it's a really fascinating kind of examination of whiteness if you're interested in that book. Okay, different theories about race. I'm going to go through these pretty fast and try to finish this up within an hour. Conflict theory is going to get us into the power inequality really significantly. So white supremacy has been a part of the foundation of the establishment of the United States of America. And so it's been part of a historical foundation all the way to present. So it's deeply rooted. Ideals, racist ideals and policies are a part of the stratified order. We have competition for resources, if there's a creation of intergroup hostility, and there's maybe political advantage of creating that hostility between groups. So having groups fight against each other versus recognizing their collective interest. So having, you know, working class whites fighting against different racial groups and different racial groups fighting against versus racial groups versus recognizing their collective interest. So from a conflict, I mean, that becomes a way of separating people versus uniting people to bring about change. So conflict theory is trying to understand, how does this order of racism operate? Who's benefiting from it? The competition that's coming out, that's being created between racial groups, is supporting an economic system, supporting a system of capitalism that's benefiting some people. It gets into all those different kind of spaces. Things like the war on drugs in the 1980s and 1990s, policies like stop and frisk, where law enforcement were given like free rein to be able to stop people they believed that were potentially going to be committing a crime. It was eventually identified as unconstitutional. Redlining as a practice, as I already mentioned, which happened for a long period of time. Deindustrialization, loss of manufacturing jobs in a lot of different cities. Like a lot of things that are going on that are very macro level things that are reflecting inequalities, agitating inequalities, adding to them. So conflict theory is going to be looking at power, inequality, trying to understand all that different kind of stuff. Monuments to the Confederacy. I think one thing to look at, as civil rights movement was gaining more power in the 1950s, 1960s, a lot of monuments were to the Confederacy were put into place in different cities at that particular moment in time. Stone Mountain, Georgia, Atlanta, Georgia was a center for a lot of civil rights activism. Martin Luther King Southern Christian Leadership Conference coming out of Georgia, and there became this huge monument to the Confederacy during a moment in time where there was a sort of rise and development of kind of race consciousness, advocacy, and understanding about civil rights. So kind of see it's like this competition going on, and it's preserving, you know, kind of power. Scapegoating theory is an extension of conflict theory, that sometimes the root of the problem is ignored, and a group, oftentimes a vulnerable group, and oftentimes that's a racial group, gets blamed for the problem. So we see this like with immigration historically all the way to today, that immigrants get blamed for economic troubles of different groups, blamed for stuff going on within communities. It's not to say that we shouldn't, you know, have sound good immigration policies, but we start to get to a point where politicians are promoting this idea that immigrants are doing A, B, C, and D, that we're scapegoating the problem onto immigrants and not thinking about, what about corporations that are benefiting from all this labor? What about all these different kind of issues? And this, you know, this goes back historically in the United States, deeply rooted. This is the Black Irish. This is the Chinese devouring Uncle Sam. Concerns about immigration go way back, and how immigration can be used as a tool, political tool, to facilitate maintaining power and inequality. Interactionism get us to the space of thinking about, man, identities and our identities and formation of racial identities, how we see the world, social construction of reality. This example within the journalism in recent years, recognizing and writing about racial groups using a capital for Black, capital for other communities of color, but not for white, to recognize that there's a distinct identity for members of different racial groups that are in subordinate positions in society, to recognize that through the language of description here, to capitalize the letter of that particular group. Social construction of race, meanings that we associate with race. I think you could go with interactionism and conflict theory, think about critical race theory. How do different people see critical race theory? How do they form their ideas of critical race theory? If they're supporting, or, I mean, this became a lightning rod for a lot of stuff. And there's a lot of reports and evidence that people can have strong convictions about critical race theory, but not even be able to define it. So there's a lot of stuff that's going on in interactionist space, a lot of stuff that's going on potentially in a whiteness space, a lot of stuff that we can kind of try to examine with our ideas about conflict theory, like people maybe feeling economically threatened by this, like what's going on? Like, how do we understand the controversy around this conversation about critical race theory? And if I go back to my chapter, you know, anyway, I don't want to go back there. I'll just kind of end here, but I think it's kind of an interesting short little video, give you a little bit of like why Americans are divided over critical race theory, if you are interested. And I think that's it. There's a lot of content there. Hope you, gained a lot of information perspective. As I mentioned at the beginning, there's just so much we can get at. You take a whole class in these different subject areas. There is a class, SOC 212, race, class, and gender, where we spend the whole term just diving deeper into a lot of these different subject areas. I encourage you to take that if you're interested. Thanks for all you do. Have a great, wonderful day and rest of your week. And yeah, until next time.